So I'd just like to introduce Beck to everybody. Some of you will know her well, but those who don't. Beck completed her PhD thesis, which was research on household food insecurity in Australia. She's a mixed method public health researcher with applied and academic experience, and also has quite a bit of experience in not-for-profit food programs, social and health policy, and nutrition inequities. Currently, Beck's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Physical Activity and Nutrition at Deakin University, and she's a director of the Community Grocer. Beck was previously the Victorian convener for the Right to Food Coalition Australia, and I can testify that she's put an enormous amount of energy and intellectual power and creativity and thoughtfulness into this whole issue of right to food and how best to progress that agenda. I just forgot to say before, if you'd like to tell me where you're from and put that in the chat, that would be great, so we know who's here and where you're from. Having said that, I'd like to hand over to Beck, who will do a presentation for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a question and answer and discussion session. So over to you, Beck.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that warm welcome, and yeah, nice to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well that are interested in this issue on the webinar today, or possibly listening to this recording. I too want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm coming to you from Carlton in Melbourne on our first day out of lockdown, which is a really wonderful feeling. And before I kick off too, it is really important to me to acknowledge the funding and the support that I've got from the Right to Food Coalition to do some of the work that I'm going to be sharing with you. And also my lovely collaborators at Monash University, Liza, Barbour, and also Steph Godrich at ECU. I'm just speaking to you over my laptop camera, and to sing out, perhaps speak up if there's any issues with the audio, because I can pop on a headset. So let's kick off. As Liz said, I want to spend about 20 minutes or so talking you through, to some extent, the current status about hunger and food insecurity in Australia. Although I'm actually taking it as a given that if you're coming along to a session like this one, and having had a chance to have a bit of a look at some of the attendees list, many of you already know and are really experts and work a lot already in this issue. So I won't spend too much time painting that picture, but instead I want to share with you what I've learned about what a human rights approach is. And I'm not an expert, and it's been a really big learning curve. And I really welcome the perspectives in the questions and discussion time, which I hope we have a lot of time for, to hear about how others have used human rights frameworks or mechanisms, where they think they work well, what some of the pitfalls are, and yeah, I guess how they've locally applied them. So hoping that sounds good to everyone. And we'll kick off with a bit of a snapshot, as I said, on the kind of current status of hunger or household food insecurity in Australia. So it's a pretty substantial public health issue in this country, and prevalence can range from somewhere between sort of 4% and 13%, based on kind of robust national measures. We think that this many people are impacted by this issue, and we also have some community reports that kind of look at this problem as well. And I know very recently, a couple of days ago, Food Bank estimated that as many as 20% of Australians will have been impacted by this issue, and they collected that data over the kind of COVID and lockdown era. So we might expect a spike in food insecurity as a consequence of COVID, absolutely. And there are particular populations that are at an increased risk of food insecurity. They include those that are on a low income or no income, seeking employment, or are currently underemployed. people who are single parents, people who are seeking asylum or are refugees or new migrants, people who are impacted by homelessness, and also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The prevalence is something like 1 in 5 in Australia in those communities. So the implications of this public health and food and justice problem are substantial, and they really include physical and health implications that are both acute but can also stay with you for the long term. So it's pretty important that we do something about this problem, and I guess at best practice, a response to food insecurity would really kind of go across this well-known socio-ecological framework where a joint-up response would very much kind of come at the public policy level and, you know, go all the way down to supporting individuals with skills and behaviours and belief that supported, you know, a nutritious diet, enjoyment of foods that are culturally appropriate, safe from a non-emergency source. That's what we'd want to see in a really food-secure country. And for those of you
Beck, could I just interrupt? A couple of people are finding the sound rather muffled.
Oh,
so
yes.
You might need to go back to using the headset.
No problem. Thanks for speaking up.
How is this, Liz? Is that a bit better?
That sounds good to me. I hope that's good for the other people who are finding it tricky to hear.
Great. Well, I'll move forward unless I hear otherwise, and apologies for those that were struggling. So I was just going to mention that, you know, you no doubt will locate yourself somewhere in this space, or perhaps you're working with hunger or food insecurity in this country, and that's all really important work. And I guess kind of two big mechanisms in mind when I think about what's happening about this challenge across the country. And one of the big initiatives is what we do in kind of social welfare policy. So what sorts of measures we have for those who are, you know, experiencing poverty, which is really one of the underlying causes or drivers of food insecurity. So in Australia, one of the big welfare measures that we have are our, you know, Centrelink benefits. So just briefly, there's a bit of detail in this slide. If you were a single pensioner, this is the income that you would have been receiving in Australia in green here. If you were, obtaining a pension over the last couple of decades. If you were unemployed and accessing what was previously called New Start, this was the level of income that you were required to live off. And this is the, you know, federal poverty line, this here in yellow. So in other words, one of the big mechanisms we have to ensure that people have an adequate standard of living has been failing, and it's been failing for a couple of decades. Another large kind of response that we could point to when we think about how Australia is tackling food insecurity is the work of non-profit organisations, and there are 3,000 plus frontline agencies across this country that provide free or subsidised access to food, and many of them are linked in with these more logistics-based organisations, OzHarvest, Second Bite, Fair Share and Food Bank. And to some extent, these organisations also do frontline food relief as well. So it's a really you know, diverse sector, and I've had a chance to work with and for some of these organisations, and this is just a bit of a crude snapshot of the size of this particular response to food insecurity. So if you kind of pull together the data, just what these logistics organisations are moving by way of food to food insecure people across the country, we know that they are having a really dramatic growth. So since 2008, 2009. We knew that they were removing about 19,500 tonnes of food across the country, but you fast forward just 5 or 6 years later and they've more than doubled in size. And the last time that I did this crude snapshot, I was capturing data from 2016-17. They were 2.5 times their size, and I don't have a more recent snapshot, although I absolutely ought to. So as Liz said, back in 2014, a kind of group came together and they called themselves the Right to Food Coalition. And I guess I've only been kind of working in this community food security space myself for a bit over a year. I was starting to read about food security and starting to attend events and hear more about a human rights-based approach to addressing hunger, a human rights-based approach to working to advance food security. And I sort of scratched my head and I didn't quite know what that meant. And I'm still learning what it means. But you could look to people like Jill Whelan and Sue Booth, who were saying, if we took a human rights-based approach, we'd be upholding dignity. There'd be legal entitlements to food, and we'd be really looking to government for major accountability. And Davies as well, who really emphasised that if you're taking a human rights-based approach, participation of communities that are being impacted by food insecurity, they're the ones that are making the decisions and they're leading the solutions. So this was kind of, and that's really where my kind of own learning began. And like I said, I started to wonder, well, what is a human rights approach? And so I'm going to spend the next kind of 10 minutes or so sharing with you what I've learned about the human right to food so far, or at least sharing with you some of the key things and the aha moments that I've had in learning about human rights. So this is a brief snapshot of the history, and it won't surprise you that human rights are really, enshrined and came from the Declaration of Human Rights post-World War II, back in the 40s, and then they kind of became formalised in the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So, most countries around the world basically signed up to these things, including Australia. And when you sign up to these things, you say, okay, yep, we understand that that's kind of internationally the direction that we're going. We're going to domestically put in place our own mechanisms to ensure that we can deliver on these international agendas. Theoretically. I guess I'd say, broadly, there wasn't too much more movement around the human right to food per se in the 80s and 90s. But by about this era, and in response to kind of world crises around food, it had a bit of a renaissance, and it really was revisited, this human right to food and the need for international agreements, as well as a lot of work domestically to ensure that everyone, irrespective of age, income, race, etc., everyone could eat well. And this was really this World Food Summit in the kind of late 90s. This was where things like a food for all agenda was born, and terms like food security and the dimensions of food security were defined. So this has been one of my aha moments, that whilst I learned in my own career and my own training in kind of nutrition and public health about food security, I didn't realize that it necessarily came from the origins were around human rights. So that was an aha moment for me, that in fact I was working in a human rights-based approach because I draw a lot and seek to advance food security for everyone, particularly people who are impacted by food insecurity. So in the 90s as well, this was kind of the era that led to the appointment of a special rapporteur on the right to food. So this was a person that was agreed to by all member states of the United Nations, that had this kind of high level remit to look at how the right to food was being realised globally, but they could also visit particular countries to look at what was happening, barriers and enablers, and what sorts of recommendations they'd make to the country to make some advancements. And the FAO also put out these 19 voluntary guidelines that member states could follow to ensure that they were doing all that they could to respect, protect and fulfill the right to food for all. So again, kind of drawing on that international base to understand, well, what might a human right to food look like in Australia? What could we kind of be doing, or what are we already doing? I've looked to the work of this particular special rapporteur, and he fortunately visited Canada in 2012. So he really provides advice to Canada that I think is quite relevant in Australia, because it's a similar context, so not a low or middle income developing context. And so his advice, in summary, after his visit, was really human right food of government, and also prioritise local food systems, focus on children, and absolutely be underpinned by law. That social assistance, so welfare benefits, need to count, the cost of food, so that everyone can have an adequate standard of living. And same goes for a living wage that needs to be set at a rate where you could afford food locally, and also importantly, and in focus on Indigenous people having access to lands and water. And other international perspectives as well have helped me understand what a human right to food is, and what it's not. And one of the things that particularly Graham Ritchie's points to is that food charities don't really alter the dynamics that perpetuate food insecurity, or they don't typically. And so that, they're not an example of a right to food approach, and that monitoring is really important. You need to understand the issue of food insecurity or hunger, but also you need to really tie that monitoring and data to action. Someone like Anderson suggests, the work needs to be informed by that of the international human rights bodies. Absolutely, that's what they're there for. And problems become violations of human rights, including according to Dowler and O'Connor, who kind of work in the UK. So, I was kind of looking at globally, like countries, what is the human right to food? What can you sort of point to and definitively say it is happening or it's not? And then with some of that learning, I worked with Steph and Liza to try and understand, well, how has that played out in the Australian context? And so just with my last kind of 5 minutes, I want to share with you a bit about what I've learned, or what we've learned together. So one of the things that we've done is we looked at those voluntary guidelines that were set up, and we tried to assess Australia's kind of progress against the guidelines. And they're pretty comprehensive. This is a couple of 100-page document, and these projects we've pretty much done in our spare time. So we prioritised, and you can read more about this work in this particular commentary if you'd like to. We prioritised some of the guidelines that we thought were most relevant to household food insecurity or hunger in Australia. So they're the guidelines that are on the left of the screen, and I'm sorry, we probably don't have too much time to talk about this in detail, but if we hone in on one, for example, down the bottom there, number 17, they've got, several pages around policies and project monitoring indicators and benchmarks associated with, ensuring the right to food for every citizen in your country. And so, we could point to Australia's endorsement of the Sustainable Development Goals as some evidence that we do have some monitoring and some benchmarks and some targets to aspire towards. But equally, we could kind of look at something like the population measurement of household food insecurity or hunger might be, used as a proxy for hunger, and say that we've got some pretty big gaps, although it does look like we are going to get some better data on household food security moving forward, which is wonderful. But overarchingly, we have imperfect tools, and we have some big measurement gaps in terms of our monitoring, indicating and benchmarks against that global voluntary guidelines, against what kind of world leaders agreed to are the best ways forward to addressing a right to food. So that's kind of in a nutshell one of the projects that we've done of late. And now I'll talk to you a little bit about a second project, and perhaps some of the people on the line were actually interviewees in this study, which I'm very, very thankful for your perspectives. And I'll do my best, I hope, to represent them accurately. So we wanted to talk to like local Australian public health, food security experts to sort of say, well, what do they think about this human right to food? And, you know, if it were realised, what sorts of roles and responsibilities would there be for different stakeholders, and what might be some of the barriers and enablers to achieving the right to food in Australia. So if you'd like to read a bit more about this particular study, and both of these are publicly accessible, you can find more about this study with this paper here. So we were able to do some in-depth interviews with 30 key informants, and we sampled in academia, non-profit, and we had representatives from both state and local government. We did try and get some people that worked in national government, but we weren't able to, and we probably had quite a few academics, which is incredible. So we also tried to increasingly emphasise those that worked outside of academia to include their perspectives in this sample too. And we analysed the interviews using Kingdon's policy framework, which you don't need to know too much of the details about, because I'm going to talk to you about them as I kind of step you through the results over these last few slides. So I guess one of the things that we sort of learned from this process is, you know, are we already doing a human right to food approach in Australia, and how are we doing it, and should we be doing it more? And our interviewees said, yes, it's helpful and it's being used, or, you know, it could be further used. So if you want to call, you know, hunger work or food insecurity work human right to food work, that can be quite a helpful frame, and that can be a helpful way of working when there's states and territories, when you're working in those states and territories that have human rights charters, when you're trying to link in with the Sustainable Development Agenda or other international commitments or other, you know, UN initiatives. It can also help frame this kind of hunger problem in a way that can link you in with other rights-based organisations or agendas, like the rights of a child. And others observed, perhaps similar to me, that it was kind of a newish or a kind of a growing kind of topic area or way of framing the problem that was getting perhaps some momentum. And that it also was a way of kind of reframing the problem of hunger away from victim blaming. At the same time, it has some limitations. So some said it was, you know, a lefty agenda, utopian and academic. Our interviewees felt that it might not be something that would kind of resonate with the general community, and that there might be other terms that would elicit a better response. And I guess this one is kind of particular to human rights, you know, framing, that without a national charter of human rights and it not being in our domestic legislation, you know, it's kind of limited value. And also that our sector, which might include people on this webinar and, you know, others that work in this food security space, we're not necessarily trained in nor fully cognizant of what these human rights principles and mechanisms are, and perhaps even less so for those that are outside of our sector. So that was one of the key findings after talking to those 30 public health experts. And we also asked them, okay, well, what sorts of roles and responsibilities would you see, and who are some of the key players? And I'll just briefly, I guess, emphasize, and this has been like another aha moment for me in my learning about the human right to food. and that is that it absolutely designates government as kind of ultimately responsible for every citizen or every person in their nation's right to, to food. So, the buck stops with government when you take a human rights to food approach, and it's not the responsibility of others. So, a range of actions, and I've kind of already outlined what you might imagine those are, from monitoring to setting national agendas to consulting with community. And there are obviously other roles for other sectors, absolutely. And these are the, sort of actors that we might expect to be involved in a human rights-based approach to addressing food insecurity. When we asked about enablers and barriers to taking a human rights approach to food, some felt that, it was getting more coverage, particularly perhaps in light of COVID and bushfires, which was right at the time that we were doing these interviews as well. So issues around hunger and food affordability and food systems and unemployment were, and natural disasters and climate change, all of these topics were like pretty big and still are to some extent. So, maybe this kind of was a time to kind of press this issue, and that there were particular agendas or policy windows that might sensibly be linked into in order to make some advancement. But equally, there are some challenges in framing something as a human rights violation. It becomes something that's very hard to fix, or it's not well understood. It's not something that we monitor terribly well. That the food charities that are sort of at the front line of this issue are already stretched, and that, again, without that sort of enforceable human rights law, is it really kind of worth framing it or talking about it as a human right? So I'm really keen to hear the perspectives of others. So I do want to wrap up, but I want to share with you, I guess, like in summary, what have I actually learned about spending some time thinking and writing and talking and synthesizing some of the work that I've done over the last few years. And I kind of left myself with this question, which is a human right to food approach actually that different to more typical health promotion or public health nutrition or kind of food security policy and practice? Is it that different to what I kind of see out there and what I've done in my career to date, and what others probably do as well? So yes, I think it is different and novel, because it has those legal and international mechanisms that I've pointed to. And even without them, so those are important, but you can still do human rights without linking into the Sustainable Development Agenda, or without working at the international level, or without those legal mechanisms, because I've also learned there's principles that are that come from using this approach as well, and anyone can implement them. So some of those principles or the designated roles and responsibility include things like communities that are being impacted by food insecurity have to have major participation and leadership in solutions. And those solutions really need to focus on root causes and seek to increase agency and address power imbalances. And it's governments, not charities, that are ultimately responsible for ensuring that everyone can eat. So it is new and it's novel, and these are the ways that it is. But I've also learned in other ways, it likely underpins, maybe without even knowing, a lot of the conceptualization of the work that's done in food security or food sovereignty, social determinants of health, and some of the other kind of dominant, programs and policies in my era working in this space. This kind of means it's plagued by some of the same challenges, but it also means that you can kind of use it where and when it suits, and you can, as I already said, take on its its principles without those legal and international mechanisms. So my advice is keep it in your toolkit, and use it when appropriate. And it might be a new way for you, or it might be a way that you've been doing for many, many years. So I really couldn't have done this work without a fantastic team of research assistants and sounding boards and funding, and of course the very kind time that those key informants provided for that last study that I outlined as well. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Becca.
Thank you.
Liz has just jumped off, but she's back on now. So
yeah, no, I didn't mean, no, Beck froze and I couldn't hear anything, so I thought it must have been just me, not Beck, I think. That was fantastic, Beck. Thank you so much. There's a lot of food for thought in there. And I have to say that when we first came up with the name Right to Food, we were looking perhaps not so much for linking to whole human rights agenda as trying to come up with a very positive statement of what we wanted, rather than starting from a negative point of view of fighting hunger, fighting poverty, fighting food insecurity. So we thought the Right to Food was a very strong, which I still think it is a strong statement. It certainly, I think, from the number of people who came to the conference we had in 2014, it resonated with a lot of people. But we then realised that we needed to think more closely about how it related to possible human rights framework and how we might be able to use that. I think there's two ways of thinking about it, both as a awareness raising, to think about posing the right to an adequate diet as a human right, whereas a lot of the work that's done to address food insecurity is done, as you were saying, very much from a charitable basis, which is such a different way of looking at it. So I'd be interested to hear how other people have found in the work they've been doing, how the language they've been using has affected the way that they've been able to do their work, or what kind of language resonates with people. You've given us some great examples from the people that you interviewed. I wonder whether other people could comment on whether that's what they have found when they've been using the language, or how they like to frame things. Is there anybody there who'd like to comment on that?
Sorry, Leah Gelfin, I'd be happy to put in a couple of points if that's okay, please.
Yep, that's great.
I'll just turn my video on, thank you. So fantastic research, Beck. I love your work, I'm a huge fan. And I think actually this is a great reminder for old timers like myself that we probably need to refresh how we talk about this issue. So I've had an aha moment actually listening to your presentation today, so thank you for that. Because we've really been struggling to get any traction in this space. You know, I mean, here in Tasmania, we've just had a new food security strategy released in the last couple of months, but it's almost entirely about emergency relief, which is, you know, enormously disappointing, particularly because you made that point very well about how that's not the solution. So I think we do need to reframe how we talk about it, and I'm certainly going to use what you've spoken about today. So mine was just really just a thanks very much for your great work.
Beck, I've got a question for you. If I wondered if you thought if there's any particular other countries we could look to who've adopted this framing. I know that in your article you cited some work in the US and the UK. So I wonder if there's any ways that you felt that using this framework had been done successfully in other countries, so we could look to anybody else. And are there any leaders in this space that we could maybe draw some advice from?
Yeah, thanks for your comments, Leah, and for the question, Liz. I was able to, when I was a convener at the Right to Food, to connect in with some of the Canadians that had organised around having the special rapporteur visit. And they were interesting to talk to kind of 5 years or so on from his visit. They did feel that it was quite an impactful one. And, there were kind of multiple forces at bay, as is often the way, but they monitor food insecurity very well over there. They are piloting things like universal basic incomes. They have kind of reasonably good job, I think, at sort of social protection and social welfare. So yeah, they could be like an interesting kind of country, I guess, to learn from and perhaps help to inspire us to try and get the special rapporteur here, the next special rapporteur to Australia. So we did try that. Yeah, I'd probably point to them as our kind of nearest similar, and I get the sense that they're making some good progress. At the same time, they have some substantial issues as well, and generally a higher measured prevalence of food insecurity, some pretty big geographical challenges, some pretty big powerful food industry like we do as well. Yeah.
I've just got, oh, sorry, Christina, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question too. Yeah, thanks, Beck. That was really awesome work and very useful. Something that I keep thinking about, and I know my background's in nutrition, so sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable stepping outside of it, but I really keep thinking, like, while it's going to be great to have a national obesity strategy, some other countries seem to get more traction because they've got strategies like that are aiming to reduce inequities in health, or treaties with their First Nations people. And I just wonder, like, how much should we be advocating for those types of policies and legislations, or the human rights legislations that put this sort of stuff front and center on the political agenda, and how useful would that be for our work?
Yeah, it sounds pretty useful, doesn't it, mate? Yeah, I mean, can you think of some countries that have made more progress, to answer that past question? And I know of your great work in this space too, because I agree, like, probably the biggest nutrition issue that gets traction, and it ain't much, is probably obesity in Australia, and equity-oriented or environmental-oriented food issues, not so much. And I put equity last.
Yeah, I mean, based on my work, that's what we see as well. Like, we analysed a whole bunch of national nutrition policy strategies and obesity prevention strategies. But what was impressive was the very few that got that strategy in place because there was some other equity-oriented strategy that they could refer to. So I think in Scotland, they've got some strategy that's all about reducing inequities. In New Zealand, they've got treaties with their First Nations people, so equity is embedded in every single thing they do. And it just feels to me like, unless we get something like that in place, like, we're always going to be struggling and behind with this sort of stuff.
Yeah. I wonder, and Leah, I know you did work in this space, and there'll be perhaps others on the call as well, but there was this kind of era of a social inclusion agenda being, and a time, I guess, of Labor leadership, if we perhaps might categorise them as a bit more left-leaning or a bit more kind of welfare-friendly. I think we did see quite a lot of food and equity type policies come out of that type of agenda, but how you frame it with kind of current governments, or more neoliberal or more kind of conservative governments, I don't know if others have any advice. Or, yeah, Leah, what's your take there? Am I misremembering?
No. In Tasmania, and I must give credit to my colleagues that are on the line today, especially Alison Ward, who was deeply involved in this. Tasmania used to have a really magnificent strategy. You can still find it online, called Food for All Tasmania, I think it was. correct me if I'm wrong, please, Al, in the comments. And it's interesting because when we were making submissions for the food security strategy this year, we had a look back at that document, which was from 2012, and it was still fantastic. You know, it really looked at all of the different levels that you could act, all of the different, you know, place-based policy, all the different settings, you know, workforce capacity. It just had so much in it. You know, social enterprises, you know, so many things that you see examples of on their own being successful, but of course, because it's not scaled up, haven't had the impacts that they could have. So yes, certainly, unfortunately, when we had a change of government here in Tasmania, that strategy got thrown out, and it's really taken us 6-7 years to get a strategy again, and we've ended up with one that's not going to achieve the sort of objectives that we like. In the monitoring space, though, I think we've done really well in Tassie. I hope you don't mind if I brag for just a moment, and it's really down to the work of Catherine Kent and Sandy Murray and Stuart Auckland. They've been monitoring food security using a 6-question tool based on the US tool, and monitoring it all through COVID and even the last couple of months. So we've actually now got some really good data around what the prevalence looks like and vulnerable groups. So yeah, I mean, the numbers are impactful, but it's hard to keep things in people's minds and in the media for long enough. And ultimately for me, I think it's because we're not organised enough. There are so many groups that, you know, have carriage of important social issues or nutrition issues, and I don't feel like any of them at the moment truly represent the people that are working in the space of trying to improve food security. So I ultimately think that it's an organisation, us being not organised enough. So we haven't harnessed our power sufficiently yet. And I think that would make the difference.
Do people think that the pandemic gives us an opportunity to revisit some of that because of the way that the failures have been shown? I mean, I find it interesting that the minute there's a discussion that's, well, at the minute there's a spotlight that tries to show what the impact has been on people of losing their jobs and all the uncertainty, being out lockdowns, being able to go out, unable to go out. There's always articles about food insecurity. There's always articles about the emergency food relief. It never seems to translate around to the other side, which is this is clearly the first thing that happens, the first impact on people. Why don't we treat it with the same importance when we're looking at how we make provisions for people to live reasonably healthy lives? Even if you weren't looking at a human right and people leading decent lives, you could look at it from the point of view of finance and the cost of the health system from obesity and all the associated chronic diseases.
Liz, it's Lynn Saville here. I can only support what you're saying, and also what the two previous speakers just have said. I think COVID has made it, probably because of the emergency of the situation, very difficult for people in the community to do those same measurements, but to look back on it at such a time for opportunity. And just to put on another hat at the moment, the World Health Organization just last week, and this is slightly different from human rights, but it absolutely links with it. Because of the COP26, they're urging that we transform the way we do so many things. And as much as renewable energy is important, it's also how we transform our lives in terms of our food systems and using more plant-based proteins. And I guess that means perhaps recommending foods that are non-animal, which may be against some people's food preferences, but it can be more affordable. And so they're just some suggestions about other approaches, but perhaps this does give people time now post-COVID to reanalyse the situation. And certainly more people are in financial difficulties at the moment, and it doesn't seem like that's going to go away in a hurry. So I think it's a really good opportune time to progress that. Thanks, and thanks for the conversations.
Becca, has anybody else got a question? Because if not, I'll jump in with another. I was interested that you talked about whether the Sustainable Development Goals were a useful mechanism, because I understand that there's various ways of looking at using that terminology, right to food. So there's how people understand that as a way of framing away from individual responsibility towards government responsibility, but also looking at what kind of mechanisms there are that mean then that there's a requirement on government to fulfill those requirements. So if we haven't got any legislation or human rights on food in government, I know some people have looked at Sustainable Development Goals as something that Australia has to report on and that we have to make some comments on. So I went back and had a look at some of the Sustainable Development Goals reports and the listed projects, and I find it very disappointing, because if you look at the Sustainable Development Goal projects, they all tend to be emergency food relief or occasionally small scale helping people to get into jobs, which is, it might be a weaving project here, or several of them are actually overseas, not in Australia. And if you look at the report on the Sustainable Development, the Zero Hunger Goal, the first part, the one in 2018, I found was all about agriculture, and then there's a kind of nod right at the end to food insecurity, but it's still really minimised. And I know that when the last round of reporting was being done, that New South Wales Health really considered that it wasn't a big issue for Australia. So I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment, or anybody else, on how we, because I recognise that is a mechanism, there is regular reporting required. How could we lift the requirement to actually report in those goals on what's happening in Australia?
Yeah, I think it could. That's wonderful that you've done that digging, Liz, because it's not always easy to find what's ultimately reported on from what I've seen, but by government. So it could be a bit of carrot and stick, like depending on people's roles, if they're working in a local council or state or federal or some other kind of government related role where that SDG mandate has come down, then wonderful, like it could be used to help catalyse and support and set targets for and resource work around the right to food, but equally some asking questions about or identifying post-reporting, like you have, doing some advocacy around that. Liz, when you find out, like what you have found out, pointing that out, so I don't know, it's just like weapons of the week, isn't it? But, a letter to the editor or writing some commentary about it. And there are some formal mechanisms with the United Nations in the form of these shadow reports, which non-profit organisations can put in after the kind of formal federal government reports that might show, it might tell a different story. So that's, I guess, that's more the stick approach that can be used when you link in with these kind of international agendas. That's the kind of accountability and advocacy work.
Liz and Beck, I might just jump in. Jan had a question before around breastfeeding. And so Beck, maybe in your learning and research about the right to food, how does breastfeeding sort of come up in that human right to food and cognition space? I'm wondering if you had any comments there.
It's not something that I know loads about, no. Except perhaps kind of, broadly that I know people can, as in researchers, can often look at power and power imbalances and perhaps, big food unfairly and absolutely kind of dominating the infant food space that can potentially displace breastfeeding and, using a human right to food argument about why that's wrong and what power is at play. So I've some other colleagues at Deakin, including Phil Baker and Jennifer McCann, are wonderful that I could recommend, that do quite a lot of work in that infant space.
Hi, if we are not running late, Rebecca, I just want to ask you something. So when we say that it's a human right, right? So do you think like it's a little bit difficult to frame this right, a human right to food in comparison to human right to us having a safe drinking water, or maybe having a pure air? Because see, air and water is something which is a basic need for every human being, right? But food is something which is quite little bit complex, because it becomes a desire after a certain level, right? We can have food choices. So do you think like it's a little bit difficult to frame, or it's a little bit complex to advocate these things? That's why people say that it's almost impossible to address this whole issue. Do you think that it's a little bit complex?
Yeah, I think that is one of the complexities that we heard from our key informants, that it's, it's a product as well as a basic necessity. And then there's the other kind of more legalistic argument that, say, unlike maybe political rights, or say the right to practice religion and freedom of choice of religion, those particular rights are in domestic law in Australia, unlike these economic, cultural and social rights that happen to be put into that particular covenant, which includes the right to food. Yes, I'm hearing you, Avashi. Yes, that it is a part of the complexity, but I think there's enough evidence there and some good arguments to still draw on that can be helpful in advancing a right to nutritious, safe, affordable, culturally appropriate food for all, like making sure that is a minimum that is able to be achieved.
Okay, so you mean to say that we can still keep it on the necessity side rather than going towards the desire side?
I mean, I think so, right? We need it to live.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Rebecca.
Could I ask a question, please?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or actually a statement. I think what you're missing here is the interpretation of the treaties under the Human Rights Act. We're an advocacy group, we're not legal, but what we've realised is that the way they're worded is it's that humans have the right to optimum health. So when you twist it back, that food is not an extra. Optimum food and optimum health are what is written in the treaty. So that's why it's a legitimate term to use for trying to achieve quality of food intake and security of food intake. I hope that helps a bit.
Actually, Becca, one of the people that you cited, the people from England, had a very similar statement to what Jan just said, which was about the human right to good food is the same as the human right to health. And I thought that was an interesting thing. It really placed food as very central to good health. So that, yes, that concurred with what you're saying, Jan. I see we've got a minute left on the Zoom. I'm not sure whether it's going to cut out at after 1 hour. It's going to go on. Okay, so if you want to stay for a few more minutes.
There was just one more question that's come up in the chat from Alison. Do you think a focus on human rights of the child may enable more political leverage? Experience of food insecurity is a form of childhood trauma and can have long-term health consequences on eating behaviours. Any comments on this?
I'd love to hear from others, Alison. It's such a great question. My most pessimistic self is still so shocked that we can't get basic things like school food right, you know, that junk food and the cost of food and the equity issues that are associated with that. But it's pretty strong and emotive and important, of course. So I would like to think that, yeah, and I could see why, from an advocacy perspective, focusing particularly on the rights of a child and protecting children from harms might be a necessary and a good way to advance nutrition and hunger prevention work in this space. What do others think?
Can I just say that I think you need to connect with UNICEF in Australia. They have platforms available that will integrate all this, or they can send you to areas where you will have, more, as another person spoke about, a combined effort. And I think that that's a space that they have a lot of familiarity with this type of thing.
I know we in New South Wales, we talked about the impossibility of listening to everything that Beck's just said, with all the new information, the ideas, the conclusions, the interpretations, the suggestions. There's a lot of food for thought in there, Beck. So in New South Wales, we've talked about having another session where we could actually have time to digest some of what you said and to maybe think about what implications that might have for where we go forward. So I don't know if that's something that other people might be interested in. I think it is quite hard to, within 1 hour, to listen to what you said, go away and think about that. And I mean, I think we need the time to go away and think about it and think, is there opportunities either for us in our own local areas or perhaps to think about how we might contribute to each other's work. So I'd say watch this space. Certainly when we plan to do that in New South Wales, if other people are interested to join us, it'd be good to hear from you too. Are there any more questions, or are we about at wrap up time? Has that Suko got a comment there? Okay, well, I think it's time to finish. Thank you, Beck, so much for doing the presentation today, but more than that, for all the work that's contributed to the research that you did and for the research. It was really good to get all that really deep thinking by all the variety of people that you talked to. So it was a couple of bits of amazing work that I think is really useful for us as a movement. Thank you. And thank you for your generosity and time today. And it was a really excellent presentation. I thought we've talked about what a complex topic it is, but I thought you broke it down really well. So it's very easy to understand and easy to follow up on bits that people are interested in. So thank you so much. And we'll talk again soon. Thanks everybody. And thanks everybody who participated.